On this edition of Jerusalem Dateline, running the gauntlet of a hostile mob to finally make it into the arms of friends and family. 8 hostages, including foreign workers, released from Gaza. Plus, author and columnist Gil Troy looks at this complicated moment in the war. Author Melanie Saul recounts experiencing antisemitism where she least expected it, and one man's battle to bust myths about the Middle East. All this and more on this edition of Jerusalem Dateline.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell, coming to you on assignment in Egypt. We'll have more about that in future programs. Right now, here's the latest Israel news from our news desk, followed by the rest of Jerusalem Dateline, hosted by CBN News Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl.
This is the third hostage release in 2 weeks as part of the Israel-Hamas ceasefire. Agam Berger, held by Hamas, was paraded on a stage in the Jabalia refugee camp. Her family celebrated her freedom by dancing with a Torah scroll and thanking God. Berger, the last female observation soldier to be released, was handed over to the Red Cross, transferred to the IDF, and finally reunited with her family. Arbel Yehud and 80-year-old Gadi Moses, who were kidnapped from their homes in kibbutz near Oz, were held by Islamic Jihad. The group released a video Thursday showing the two being reunited before being released. In a last-minute development, 5 Thai workers were also released. They were among 10 foreign nationals working in farming communities who were abducted on October 7th and still held hostage. 3 more Israeli hostages, as yet unnamed, are due to be set free on Saturday. The 3-part deal should lead to Hamas releasing all the remaining hostages, but it also forces Israel to free hundreds of Palestinian prisoners who've committed acts of terror and murdered Jews. Jerusalem Post columnist Gil Troy told CBN News, even if the deal is worrying, Israel made a lot of gains in Gaza and Lebanon since this deal was first proposed last May.
Since May, we've seen Hezbollah humiliated, Iran weakened. We've seen Hamas further degraded. And so even though Hamas is celebrating, they're celebrating in ruins. Even though Hamas is celebrating, they've lost over 20,000 of their top terrorists.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met again with President Trump's Mideast envoy Steve Witkoff. In a surprise move, Witkoff visited families of other hostages today as they gathered to watch the hostages being released.
I think it's showing wonderful how joyous the people of Israel are and all over the world.
Netanyahu is set to be the first foreign leader to meet with the new president in Washington next week. President Trump is suggesting Israel's neighbors, Jordan and Egypt, take in many of the Palestinians made homeless by the war in Gaza. But Egypt's president is outright rejecting the notion, hinting that Palestinians might be a threat to his government.
I would like to reassure the Egyptian people that the harm to Egypt's national security could never be tolerated or allowed.
El-Sisi insists the answer is creating a Palestinian state.
The 2-state solution, side by side, security and peace for the Israeli citizen and security and safety for the Palestinian citizen.
Many Israelis point out they gave the Palestinians Gaza already, and Hamas turned it into a deadly terrorist state that launched a deadly attack. The Syrian rebel who led the overthrow of the Assad regime is now Syria's interim president. Islamist Ahmed al-Shara used to lead Syria's version of al-Qaeda, but he swears he's moderated his views and will lead a democratic government. The 8 hostages set free Thursday came home to a hero's welcome from family and friends and the country.
The entire state of Israel embraces you, as do my wife, Sarah, and I. This release was achieved, first of all, thanks to our heroic soldiers, and it was also achieved thanks to the steadfast and determined stand that we took during the negotiations.
On the helicopter to the hospital, Agam Berger held a sign thanking the country and saying, "I chose the path of faith, and in faith I returned." Berger, a violinist, was the last of 5 female IDF lookout soldiers to be released. She had a joyous reunion with family and her fellow soldiers. Gadi Moses, who turned 80 in captivity, returned to Israel smiling and was reunited with his children. Arbel Yehud, who reportedly spent her entire 482 days alone, had a chaotic exit from Gaza. She and Moses were held by Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Her exit was so chaotic that Netanyahu temporarily suspended the Palestinian prisoners' release until he had assurances from mediators that it wouldn't happen again.
During the release of our hostages today, we all saw shocking scenes. We made it clear to the mediators that we do not intend to accept any risk to our hostages.
The Thailand hostages, who have no family here, were greeted at the hospital by their country's ambassador to Israel.
Thank you so much. I'm sure that they will feel at home here.
The 3 hostages expected to be released on Saturday after 484 days in captivity are Ofer Calderon, American-Israeli Keith Siegel, and Yarden Bibis, whose wife and 2 little boys, Kfir and Ariel, are still held hostage. Negotiators will start hashing out the details of the second phase of the hostage deal on Monday, which should lead to the release of the remaining living hostages and Israeli forces withdrawing from Gaza. Among the 110 Palestinian prisoners freed Thursday in exchange for the hostages was a West Bank terrorist leader with the blood of many Israelis on his hands. Zakaria Zubeidi was given a hero's welcome by a huge crowd in Ramallah as he thanked Allah for his freedom. Despite more than a year of crushing blows, Hamas says it won the war in Gaza. A senior official for the group tells the Associated Press the Palestinian people were not defeated. The enemy did not achieve its goals. Taher Nunu insists Hamas will continue governing Gaza. Israel says it will not withdraw from Gaza without ensuring Hamas is finished and cannot rebuild. It appears President Trump may be willing to use economic pressure to get Egypt and Jordan to take in many of the Palestinians left homeless by the war in Gaza. Both countries have rejected Trump's idea, but he pushed it again Thursday.
They're going to do it. Okay, we do a lot for them, and they're going to do it.
Up next, unpacking the hostages' releases and ceasefire in Gaza with author and columnist Gil Troy. Between the ceasefire, the ongoing hostage releases, and the freeing of terrorists from Israeli prisons, the news during this time of war is coming so fast and furious, it can be hard for Israelis to process. Our Middle East correspondent Paul Strand talked to Jerusalem Post columnist Gil Troy to get some perspective and insight on the current headlines.
We're speaking with Professor Gil Troy, Jerusalem Post columnist and author of the new book, To Resist the Academic Intifada. Gil, right now, it's such a strange and disturbing time here in Israel. We're rejoicing because some of the hostages have been freed. They're back home safe. Yet at the same time, some Israeli prisons are releasing literally hundreds of Palestinian terrorists, presumably to go back out and kill Jews again. What should Israelis and their friends be feeling right now?
Welcome to the land of the Bible. In the Bible, we learn that sometimes there's times to rejoice and sometimes there's times to mourn, and sometimes that happens simultaneously. I think the great failure today in Western civilization is we don't take the time to rejoice. And so, yes, it is so easy to go into a negative spin about October 7th. We're still mourning 1,200 people killed. We're mourning hundreds of new soldiers killed. We're mourning thousands of people wounded. You could just go deep into despair. But again and again, since October 7th, we've seen so many points of light. We've seen the support of the American people. We've seen the bravery of the Israeli soldiers. We've seen the resistance and resilience of the Israeli people. And we've also seen the joy that we take with every single human life. As painful as this moment is, I'd still rather be on the side of the people, like the Americans, like the Jews, like the Israelis, who love life and celebrate every precious life that's freed, even if it's the cost of sending hundreds of murderers right back to their terrorism.
Some more bad news here. Hamas seems back in charge in Gaza. Hezbollah seems to be trying to weasel their way back into southern Lebanon, just across the border from Israel. Iran is racing pell-mell to get their hands on nuclear weapons, develop them. And much of the world is attempting to criminalize Israel for defending itself against all these, horrible foes. Can Israel survive? Can it somehow win against all this evil?
Since May, we've seen Hezbollah humiliated, Iran weakened. We've seen Hamas further degraded. And so even though Hamas is celebrating, they're celebrating in ruins. Even though Hamas is celebrating, they've lost over 20,000 of their top terrorists. So I am obviously worried, but I'm also rejoicing because thanks again to American support and to Israeli grit, we have seen a change.
Donald Trump is urging Muslim nations to take in scores of Palestinians in Gaza, yet the world seems dead set against letting any Gazans out of there. Why?
Palestinians get a pass, and much of the Arab world gets a pass. It's very interesting. Long before President Trump returned to office, I was wondering, Gaza shares a border with Egypt. Why is Israel only responsible for bringing in aid? Why is Israel only responsible for what goes on in Gaza? Why isn't Egypt? And so we see as this strange double standard. And lo and behold, once again, the double standard falls on the Jew. So yes, they criminalize the Jew, now the collective Jew Israel, when we try to defend ourselves. They criminalize the Jew, now the collective Jew Israel, when we say, wait a minute, what are we going to do with these people who want to hate us? And what's very, very interesting, though, this isn't coming from Israel. Israel's saying, look, we realize what's going on in the world. Most Israelis are accepting the fact that there are going to be Palestinians around and Lebanese around and Jordanians around who hate us. We also see that there are some who love us and are thankful that we're pushing back. But when Donald Trump, an outsider, comes in and says, wait a minute, logically, if we moved people out of Syria, why can't we move out of Gaza? Everybody says, how dare you? Because there's a double standard when it comes to the Jews, and frankly, when it comes to Americans too.
Yeah, okay. One last question. Israel forced every single Jew out of Gaza when they handed it over to the Palestinians and gave them total control in 2005. Is there an argument now to be made for Israeli Jews resettling Gaza?
It's amazing the speed with which after October 7th people went back to the two-state solution, without acknowledging the fact that indeed, as in 2005, Jews were left every single inch of Gaza. And they gave it to the Palestinians, and they still claimed it was occupied. And they still claimed it was the world's largest concentration camp, and they still threw these lies at us. And so it's very, very hard for most Israelis to say, well, let's go back to two-state solution thinking. Let's go back to giving them autonomy, because they used their autonomy not to build up Gaza into a beautiful Middle Eastern Riviera, but to build it into Hamasistan. And that's not just bad for Israel, that's bad for America and bad for the West too. So there's concerns. What do? One of the most important things is whether we'll sidestep the debate about whether you bring Jews back in to Gaza, but certainly, and the hostage agreement says this, there has to be a DMZ, a demilitarized zone of about 1 kilometer, keeping the Palestinians away from the Jewish villages in Israel. And that, by the way, is one of the great achievements of the hostage agreement. And for the first time, Palestinians have lost land since 1967, and that's the language they understand. Hamas understands the loss of land. And so don't believe all the celebrations on the streets of Gaza. They know they lost land, they know they lost people, they know they lost their weaponry, and we are going to win.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Gil Troy, Jerusalem Post columnist and author of the new book, To Resist the Academic Intifada.
Thank you.
Coming up, an author stands up for herself when anti-Semitism surfaces in a modern American business setting. International Holocaust Remembrance Day was this week. It was also the anniversary of the liberation by the Allied forces of Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. It's been 80 years since that moment. Much of what we know about the tragedy comes from what concentration camp survivors have reported in the years since the war. Melanie Saul, the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, published a book about her own father's remarkable story. She also confronted a demonstration of anti-Semitism herself after publishing her book, and it happened in a modern business setting. Melanie Saul's father survived the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, where more than 1 million died in its gas chambers. Born and raised in Poland, Moshe Saul was 17 when the Nazis invaded. Growing up in the U.S., Melanie knew her father survived the Holocaust, although he didn't share what happened because he didn't want to burden his children. Melanie eventually interviewed him around age 85, and Moshe told her what he remembered. She wrote a book entitled A Daughter of the Holocaust. In it, she writes, "My dad often asks throughout his life, why did I survive and the rest of my family didn't? He has a deep sense of guilt that he lived, and his family members died horrible deaths. Many survivors of the Holocaust have this same sense of guilt."
And this book shares his story, but it also shares his coming to faith in Yeshua at the end of the book.
In 2024, Melanie self-published her work through Amazon's Kindle Direct Publishing. She ordered 10 copies to be delivered to her son in Manhattan so she could pick them up on a visit to the U.S. Opening the box led to a disturbing surprise.
I was shocked to see vandalism, anti-Semitic vandalism. I flipped through the books because I ordered them to bring back to Israel to give to friends of mine.
What she found was appalling.
Liberate Palestine from the river to the sea. Every single book has something written in Free Palestine. Every one of the 10 books, so they're not useful to me at all.
After Melanie initially contacted Amazon, she was refused assistance, reportedly because the time limit for making complaints and receiving customer service had expired. Then CBN News notified Amazon of the issue, and a spokeswoman sent us this statement. "We have zero tolerance for book defacement and have contacted the author to apologize. We immediately launched an investigation and will take appropriate action based on our findings." Melanie received an apology from Kindle Direct Publishing Executive Customer Relations, which said in part, "First, I want to sincerely apologize, both for your incredibly troubling experience and the difficulties you've had thus far in reporting the issue to Amazon. We have escalated this issue to the highest levels of our organization, as we have zero tolerance for this kind of book defacement." She then reached out to the American Center for Law and Justice for help.
ACLJ, as soon as we saw the situation, immediately assigned lawyers who are experts in this area, did research to find out the relevant law, because there's federal law, there's state law, and put together a memo internally, and then put a demand out to Amazon, a legal letter to Amazon, to the general counsel, and he responded the very same day.
ACLJ lawyer Jeff Balaban says Amazon expressed concern about the issue and is looking into it.
We asked that they replace the books, and they're going to replace the books. Indeed, I believe they said they're replacing multiple copies of the book. So we'll wait and see that happens.
ACLJ also demanded an investigation.
Whoever did this presumably knows her family's address, because that's where the books were sent. And this could be a very dangerous person. It's certainly an unhinged person who hates Jews. And so it's very important that they investigate and discover who it is and give us satisfaction so that the client knows that she and her family are not threatened by this individual.
Balaban says ACLJ is seeking legal repercussions.
Amazon has already said they have zero tolerance for what they call book defacement. And this goes well beyond, this was defacement of books, but well beyond book defacement. I mean, this is clearly an act of hate, an act of anti-Semitism. So yes, that person should be removed from their job.
So far, Melanie has received her money back, as well as the promise of more books. Melanie says her father would have been shocked and saddened by the defacement of the books.
Someone once pointed out to me that we're going through Holocaust 2.0, where there's anti-Semitic acts all over the world, there's anti-Semitic acts here. It would have just brought back the horrors that he went through the first time.
The most famous resolution or mantra or statement or idea to come out of the Holocaust was never again. But we're living in a time where we are seeing that never again is now.
Balaban says the desecration of Melanie's book is a small but powerful example of what's happening to the Jewish people in the U.S. and around the world.
The same hostile, evil energy seems to be alive in the world again. And the truth is, we know this, anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, it never goes away, and it can't be stopped. The problem is when it's all of a sudden, it's become open season. And the worst part of this is that what made it open season was the horrors of October 7th and the horrors of the atrocities. And all of a sudden, it's like this evil woke up in the world and said, oh, we can do this again? Let's go out and kill the Jews.
Still ahead, a content creator on a mission to bust preconceptions about Jews, Arabs, the Middle East, and who's oppressing whom. Our next interview is a young man who's taken on a difficult task in today's information war. He wants to dispel misconceptions about a lot of things: the Middle East, Jews and Arabs, ethnicities, and who's been where through the centuries. And that's just a few of his topics. He's been posting videos on YouTube for a couple of years now. Here's our conversation. Tal Oren, welcome to Jerusalem Dateline.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you are a content creator, and you have been doing some pretty interesting videos about the Middle East. So what is it that what message are you trying to convey to people about the Middle East?
So I went from a decade-long career of traveling around the world on YouTube as a blogger, and right around the time of the war, I began doing advocacy for the State of Israel, and particularly with a massive focus on Mizrahi Jews and the diaspora of Afro-Jews from Africa. And the big push that I'm trying to do is normalize or push against this narrative of white colonizers and a foreign group of people that are invaded this land and somehow took the land of other people. And really pushing a message of, there's a lot of Jews who look like me, and putting us out in the forefront so people understand that there is no genocide or apartheid or white colonizer narrative that can exist in this land.
Mm-hmm. And now Mizrahi Jews are those that came from Arab lands, forced out of Arab lands, right?
So Arab lands is actually a misnomer. What I try to push is Arabized lands. For example, my family, half of my family comes from Baghdad, Iraq. Baghdad, Iraq was an ancient part of Mesopotamia, Babylon. In the Bible, in the destruction of the first temple, the Jews were casted out to Babylon. This predates Islam, it predates Arabs as a group of people, and it predates Arabism as a pan-Arabist movement in the Middle East. So I always try to correct the narrative and say, we're not Arab Jews, but we're Jews from the Middle East that Arabs Arabized and took our culture, took our languages away, took for some people, religions away as well.
So what do you think changed in Israel after October 7th?
I think a lot of things changed. I think there's a heightened sense of awareness of unity now. While we don't always represent it in the best way, I think a lot of people are more united. But I think that maybe a lot of people are waking up to the fact that we need to be a little bit more aggressive in the media. We need to be a little bit more aggressive in the content war and pushing our agendas of the truth of what actually exists here on the ground, the coexistence, the different ethnicities, the diversity, to the forefront of what's actually going on here.
And what is it? How do you want people to view the Middle East? What do you want them to know about the Middle East that people kind of in the West space out about?
This is a really good question. I want people to understand that the Middle East has never existed in peace, ever. There has never been peace in this region. We've always been warring one with another. Now, the difference is there's been colonial empires that have come in here and have destroyed civilizations. People who are suffering right now in the Middle East, like Copts, Kurds, Assyrians, there's a long list, Mandeans in Iraq, and of course Jews, who have been ethnically cleansed from their lands. I want people to understand that just because in the West we've been taught that the narrative is that all the brown people who live in the Middle East are somehow Arab is not necessarily the truth. There is a massive, diverse coalition of nations and peoples who have existed here for millennia, and we need to start honoring their presence and helping people understand where they actually come from.
Be a little more specific. Tell me a little bit more what you're talking about, all these different peoples.
So I want people to understand that when they call Arabs of Egypt Arabs, they're actually talking about a group of people that the Arabs colonized, who were the ancient Egyptians who turned into the Coptic group of people. Or for example, when they're talking about the Arabs of Iraq, they're actually talking about a group of Mandeans, which are the native fishing people, where the kafia, the Palestinian kafia actually comes from. Mm-hmm. It was appropriated from the Iraqi people who lived there, and Jews who existed there for a long time. I want people to understand that when they talk about Morocco as an Arab country or a Muslim country, they're actually talking about a country that was dominated by Amazi people and Jews way before Islam or Arabs.
It's very interesting, very interesting. So what do you think that people miss about Israel?
I think people don't see the full picture because they can't come here. They don't have access to this place. I think that Western news and Western media a lot of times pushes the wrong narrative about our country. Mm-hmm. And I think the biggest thing I always recommend is people need to come and visit this land. See this place with their own eyes and understand the stories. I always have a saying, if somebody tells you that they think they understand Israel or they have the full picture, they're already wrong. Because I've traveled this land up and down, I've met with almost every ethnic group, and I still don't have 100% the full picture. So you can't off of just some article on the news.
Yeah, anything else you would like to share with us?
Just pray for Israel, for the people who are watching, to pray for Israel, for the security of our nation, and for the continuation of Jewish people and their sovereignty in this land, and hopefully bringing more light to all these different people around the Middle East to make a better, more peaceful Middle East.
What an amazing young man. That's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. And please keep praying for the peace of Jerusalem and the protection of all Israel, and for the successful release of more hostages this weekend. May the rest of them come home soon. Remember, the God who's watching over Israel and you and me neither slumbers nor sleeps. I'm Julie Stahl. For all of us here at the Jerusalem Bureau, we'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.